Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week I am covering the very tragic accident that took place on the banks of the River Tyne in Newcastle in 1867 with the loss of at least 3 lives. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe, it doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Before I actually get into this story, I just wanted to add that 1867 was really not a good year in Newcastle. Not only was there this disaster and the explosion on the town moor, which I have covered in another video if you haven't seen that one, but there was also a large fire that destroyed several buildings and another fire that destroyed part of the Central Exchange buildings. And I believe that there were several other smaller incidents in 1867 as well. And the latter two stories that I've mentioned here about the 2 fires, I do hope to cover in future videos. In May of 1867, a boat race was taking place on the Tyne between Robert Chambers of Newcastle and Henry Kelly of London. The race was for prize money of around £400, which today would be around £56,000, so it was quite a lot of money, and it had attracted thousands of people to the quayside to watch the 2 men row the 5 miles. The race went well and the spectators enjoyed it. However, it does seem that they would have preferred a different winner. The race was run by Henry Kelly from London, and it seems that they wanted Robert Chambers of Newcastle to win, with only a little applause given to the victor. The Tyne General Ferry Company had been asked to run special boats for the event to allow people from areas such as Jarrow, Hebburn and South Shields to attend the race. And it was said that during the day, many thousands of people had used these boats and had arrived in Newcastle without any problems. When the boat race was over, it was said that a rush of people made their way to the gangway at Newcastle to start getting onto the boats for the return journey. The ticket office was at the bottom of the gangway, and a gate had to be passed to get to this. And each boat was able to hold around 300 passengers before it would set off, with a little waiting time required before the next boat would arrive at the landing stage. And the gangways were secured to the quayside at one end and had a planked path, which is probably the best way to describe it, that led to the landing stage. And I'm sure that anybody who's familiar with the old ferry landings will know exactly what I mean. When the first boat had been filled, the gates at the bottom of the gangway were closed, and the passengers still on the gangway were then stuck, as they could neither go up because of the crowds of people behind them or down because of the closed gates. And at the time it was estimated that around 100 people were still standing on the gangway. As the first boat pulled away, the gangway suddenly made a strange creaking noise, and it was thought that it had broken away from the side of the quay. And for what seemed like only seconds, the planks of the gangway held together before they seemed to split in the middle, and almost all of those on the gangway at the time were thrown into the water. Several people who had been higher up on the gangway were luckily able to scramble back onto the quayside, but for the others it was a scene of great confusion, as many people had fallen on top of each other. The scene was awful for those to watch on the quayside, men, women and children, all trying to stay afloat in the water, with the screams piercing the early evening air. And ladies' hats were said to be seen floating in the water, and strangely even mention of loaves of bread floating down the Tyne. It was thought that as many as 60 people may have fallen into the water, and at first those on the quayside had not known what to do. They were looking down and seeing people struggling to stay above the water, but they seemed to be paralysed with shock. But within minutes they began to throw lifebuoys into the water, with other people getting ropes and attempting to pull people out, and some even using planks of wood to try and help people to get out of the water. The police, of course, had been sent for, but P.C. Foster of the River Police had already been on the quayside, and holding on to a post which was close to the river's edge, he had lowered himself down into the Tyne. Almost at once a man had taken hold of his legs, and as P.C. Foster was trying to pull himself and the man out of the water, several others tried to grab onto the first man. P.C. Foster knew it was an impossible task. He was not able to hold the weight of the people now hanging from his legs, and he sadly had to break himself free and get back onto the quayside, causing those who had been hanging onto his legs to fall back into the water. But he was not about to give up his rescue mission. Finding a boat that had not been damaged by the fall of the gangway, he and another young man got in and attempted to row to the people in the water. The boat, however, had been chained to the quayside, and it took the two men several minutes to break the chain by hitting it repeatedly with a plank of wood. When they reached the people in the water, the rowing boat almost sank itself, as far too many people had attempted to get into it, and they had to quickly row away to the landing stage. Those who had been rescued by the boat were taken to the local public houses to recover, although it was said that some had made their way to the railway station and simply gone home. P.C. Foster and the other man then made their way back in the hope of rescuing more survivors from the water. And a Mr. George Russell, who had been on the quayside, had seen a small child going under, and he had jumped into the water. The child had gone under again, and George was able to grab the child by the clothes and pull it to the surface. He then swam to the landing stage. Sadly, though, the child was already dead. Now, although this particular article doesn't state if the child was male or female, only one small child was known to have died in the accident, and this was Margaret Armstrong, who was 14 months old. News of the disaster had quickly spread, and the Chief Constable of Newcastle, Mr. Savage, was soon on the scene, and he took charge, sending for men from all of the local police stations to come and help with the rescue. Everyone worked tirelessly until all who could be rescued had been saved. It was thought that as many as 20 people were still unaccounted for. However, this number would later be changed. Sadly, the only thing left to do after this was to try and find the bodies of those who had not been saved. The work involved using grappling irons to search under the surface of the water. 2 boys were found. One was said to be just 9 years old, and the other was said to be around 11 years old, and no one else was found that night. The following morning, the search resumed. By now, there were few in the area who had not heard of the accident, and it was said that thousands lined the riverside to watch the men searching the water for the bodies of the unfortunate souls who had not been saved. Now, I have to honestly say that I cannot understand why people would have travelled to the area to watch the police and volunteers search the river for bodies, especially when some of them could quite likely have been children. It's certainly not something that I would have wanted to watch. And the tide had been running fast the previous night, and it was thought that some bodies may have been simply washed out to sea. However, the search would continue for quite some time. An inquest was opened at the Dead House the following day before Coroner Hoyle, and this was to be held on the bodies of the 3 children who had been found. Mrs. Armstrong said she came from South Shields, and she stated that one of the bodies found was that of her young baby Margaret. She said she had been standing on the gangway with her baby in her arms when it had collapsed. She said she still had hold of her when they'd entered the water, but the many people struggling around her had caused her baby to be knocked from her arms, and she'd not been able to find her, and she said she herself had been rescued a short time after this. And Mrs. Armstrong also spoke of being with her friends from Sunderland, John and Anne Mailburn. She said they had all been standing together on the gangway, and she also recalled seeing William Turbot standing beside her. She said she had spoken to him as she had been struggling to hold her baby up, and he had been so close to her that she felt he was crushing the child's legs. He had told her to rest her arm on his shoulder to help keep the baby higher up. And she said they were still talking when the gangway seemed to make a cracking sound, and they were all thrown into the water. She said she held on to her baby with one arm and clung to a piece of iron near the landing stage with the other. and she said a man pulled her from the water, and she said it was actually as she was being lifted out that her baby was knocked from her arms by others in the water. And she said her baby had been quickly pulled from the water by someone else, but it had been too late. Thomas Turbot of Hebburn said he had identified the body of his son William, who was 11 years old. He said he had sent his son to Newcastle on the day of the accident to deliver a letter for him. He knew that William then planned to go and watch the boat race, and he believed that William had planned to come home on one of the special boats put on for the event. But when he did not return home, he had gone to the dead house, and this was where he had sadly found him. John Routledge said he lived in Newcastle and had identified the body of his son Andrew, who was 9 years old. He knew that his son had planned to go to the boat race, and like Thomas, William's father, when he had not returned home, he had also gone to the dead house, and this was where he found him. And he said he did not know why he had been on the gangway, as he had no reason to use any of the boats that day, as he lived in Newcastle. John Mailburn said he was on the gangway with his wife and Mrs. Armstrong when it collapsed. He said he saw both of the boys, William and Andrew. He saw William fall into the water, but he did not see Andrew fall in. He said along with his wife he had been quickly pulled from the water. He said he felt the weight of the people on the gangway was too much for it, and in his opinion this was why it had collapsed. David Tars of North Shields said he had been on the gangway when it had collapsed. Although he too had fallen into the water, he said he had saved 5 people, assisting them onto the landing stage. But after this, he said he had become ill and faint from his time spent in the water and had to be rescued himself. He said he did not remember much about the accident, but he did see several people go under the water beside him, and he did not know if they had survived or not. Another man who was not named said he had been close to the landing stage and had seen a woman about to be dragged under it by the tide. He said he had been able to reach out and grab her, and they had both been able to get out of the water and onto the landing stage to safety. Robert Miller of South Shields said he could not describe his fear when he had been plunged into the water, nor could he express his relief when he was rescued. He said he thought several people had been drowned. George Graham and Thomas Faden both gave similar accounts, though it must be noted that Thomas felt as many as 20 had been drowned. Dr. Cook was commended for his tireless work in tending to those who had been rescued, although it does not appear that he gave any evidence at the inquest. Edward Falkers spoke of finding the bodies of the 2 boys some 2 hours after the accident. He also said he believed he had seen the ferry company tow the landing stage away to the other side of the Tyne. He did not think that they should have done this, as he thought that there may have been bodies under it, and he said he did not know where the landing stage was now. It had been said at the inquest that the broken gangway, or the landing stage, whichever way you want it, I know that was wrong before, the gangway is what I should have said, could not be found, and it was hard to be sure if they felt it had been hidden or removed, or if they simply felt it had been washed away. But it was clear that Coroner Hoyle felt it was crucial that the gangway should be examined. Mr. Burrows of the Board of Trade said the ticket office and gates for the gangway should have been on the quayside, thus limiting the number of people who could have been on the gangway at any one time. He said that he hoped the gangway would soon be found, so that it would be possible to find out why it had collapsed. Mr. Scott of the Tyne General Ferry Company said the gangway had been made around 6 years ago, and that it had been recently strengthened around 2 to 3 months ago. He could not understand why it had given way. He said it was strong enough to hold around 100 people, who he estimated would weigh around 5 tons. However, he also added that he did not actually know what weight the gangway had been made to bear. He had not the slightest thought that the gangway was not safe and secure, though, and he also added that he was sure that the gangway did not break in two, it only bent, and he was certain that if it was found, he would be proved correct. He said he had been on the gangway himself when it collapsed and had been quickly rescued. Joshua Foster of the River Police spoke of his efforts to save those in the water, as mentioned earlier. He too said he felt the weight on the gangway had been too much for it to take. And he also stated that he had been the person to tell the ferry company to tow the gangway to the other side of the river, as he felt it was making the rescue mission more difficult as it was in the way. And the last time that he had seen the gangway had been around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the accident. Chief Constable Savage said he had been in one of the many boats on the Tyne on Tuesday trying to locate the gangway, and he felt it had been pushed back into the water by the masses of people who had been on the quayside after the accident, and that it had possibly sank. He did say that he had asked for it to be pulled onto land on Monday, but the ferry company had refused. However, he said he did not believe that it had been towed away and hidden to not allow it to be examined. The inquest was adjourned in the hope that the missing gangway might be found, and thankfully it was eventually found. It had sank and it was risen back to the surface, and the surveyor to the Board of Trade, Mr. Burrows, and Mr. Toward, an engineer, had examined it in great detail. And they were in the opinion that it had not been constructed correctly and was defective. They felt the bars holding the planks had not been secured in the right manner, and the weight of the people had caused it to bend and the planks to break or split away from the sides, allowing the people on it to be sent into the river. And some mention was also made of the fact that a stationary weight on the gangway may have been okay, but the people moving and swaying would have made the stress on the gangway much heavier. The jury returned a verdict that the victims had been drowned by the breaking of the gangway, and they were of the opinion that it had not been strong enough to hold the weight of the people on it. Now, although I have searched, I was not actually able to find any further details of the accident after this, so I'm actually unable to say if the ferry company were held responsible for the deaths. However, based on the defective gangway, we have to assume that they would have been. Mr. and Mrs. Ingo, who looked after the dead house in Newcastle, which today we would call the mortuary, were kept incredibly busy with people arriving in search of their missing loved ones. However, it was sadly a case of many more people missing than bodies that had been found. And many people gave names of family members who were missing, but that there was no way to know for sure if they had even been on the gangway at the time it collapsed. Estimates had varied widely, with some saying as many as 30 could be missing. However, a later report stated that it was actually much closer to being only 6 people who had died, and at the time that the inquest was resumed, around a week and a half after the accident when the gangway had been found, only 3 bodies had been recovered, and there is no evidence to suggest that any more were ever found after this. Chief Constable Savage said after the inquest that to the best of his knowledge only one person was still missing, and this was a girl from Hebburn. However, again, it could not be proven that she was ever on the gangway at the time the accident occurred. It also has to be said that the papers of the time printed many stories that may have been untrue. Often their information was taken from people who were passing on stories that they had heard. One paper stated that a man had been found on the Tuesday. However, no mention was made of him at either the dead house or the inquest. And another story suggested that those searching the river had pulled up the body of a man with the grappling irons, but that he had fallen off the irons before he could be pulled from the water. But again, no further mention is made of this man, so we have to assume that these stories were simply hearsay. I just want to end by saying that something I found very odd about this accident was the reporting by the local newspapers. Many covered the full story, but many more simply covered the boat race in minute detail, ending with just a tiny paragraph about the dreadful disaster, and it seems that they felt the boat race was more important. This was an incredibly sad story. People enjoying an afternoon watching a boat race caught up in a dreadful accident that by all accounts should never have happened. Those who were confirmed lost were sadly all children, and two of those should really have survived. One, the young boy Andrew Routledge, who didn't really seem to have a need to be on the gangway in the first place, and another, the baby Margaret Armstrong, may have survived had her mother not lost her grip of her because of the panic of those around her in the water. It sounds that if the gangway had been made correctly, it could have held the weight of all those standing on it, or even better, if the gates had been closed at the top of the quayside, no one would have been on it for any great length of time other than to pass down it to reach the landing stage. Should the ferry company have been held responsible? Well, yes, I believe that they should have been. They should have inspected the work and made sure that the gangway had been correctly made. And I can only hope that they were, at the very least, fined for their negligence. But what do you think? Was this an accident that could have been avoided? Do you think the fault lay with the ferry company entirely? And do you think the person in charge of the gangway should even have been found guilty of manslaughter? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very tragic story interesting, and I do apologise for the mistake that I made earlier on where I actually said that the landing stage had been towed away when I did actually mean to say gangway. I do hope that you can forgive me for that. It was something that I actually didn't notice until I was actually recording the story, so entirely my fault. Anyway, I do hope that you have found this story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.